Open your banking app right now. Look at the numbers on the screen. Your mortgage, your student loans, your credit card balance, your car payment. Those glowing pixels dictate almost every major decision you will ever make. They determine where you can live, what you can eat, when you can stop working, and how much stress you will carry in your chest until the day you die. Modern society treats those numbers as an inescapable law of physics. You borrowed. You owe. You must pay it back. It is treated as a moral absolute. To default on your debt is not just a financial failure. In the modern world, it is treated as a moral failing. But what if the way we think about debt is a massive historical accident? What if the crushing weight you feel when you look at those numbers is actually a biological mismatch? Your ancient nervous system reacting to a modern trap that your ancestors would have recognized as a form of slavery. For most of human history, money did not exist. You ask an economist how ancient humans survived before coins or cash, they will tell you a very simple, logical story. It is the story Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, and it goes like this. You have an extra pair of shoes, but you want some chickens. So, you wander around your village until you find a guy who has chickens but needs shoes, and you make a trade. 3 chickens for 1 pair of shoes. A perfect, clean transaction. It makes perfect sense. It's exactly how we are taught the world works. But there is a massive problem with this story. Anthropologists and historians have spent over a century searching the globe for a society that actually relied on this kind of casual barter system. They have never found one, not a single one. The idea that human beings naturally trade objects of equal value with each other in clean, calculated transactions is a myth. For the vast majority of our 300,000-year existence as a species, humans did not barter with their neighbors. They did something completely different. Something that makes our modern financial system look deeply unnatural. To understand how your ancestors handled debt, you have to remember how they lived. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived in small bands of roughly 50 to 150 people. You knew every single person in your camp. You knew their parents, their children, and their history. In a world like that, you don't trade 3 chickens for a pair of shoes. If your neighbor needs shoes and you have an extra pair, you just give them the shoes. You don't ask for chickens in return. You don't write it down. You don't calculate an interest rate. You just hand them over. But by doing so, you have created something far more powerful than a transaction. You have created a social debt. Your neighbor now owes you one. In ancient hunter-gatherer societies, this wasn't a flaw in the system. This was the system. Anthropologists who have studied groups like the Hadza and the Kung Bushmen have observed that sharing is not optional. It is a rigid, unspoken rule. If a hunter brings down a large animal, he does not own the meat. He distributes it to the entire camp, often keeping the worst cut for himself. In a world before refrigeration, hoarding food was impossible. But you killed a mammoth, the meat would rot before you could eat it all. Your only choice was to give it away, and by giving it away, you were essentially depositing calories into a social bank. Generosity was the original savings account. When you were sick, or when you had a bad week hunting, the people you had fed would feed you. That wasn't a mathematical burden. It was the glue that held the entire species together. If you didn't owe anyone anything, and nobody owed you anything, it meant you were completely alone. And in the ancient world, being alone meant you were going to die. In this system, exact math was actually considered an insult. If a neighbor gave you a basket of berries, and you immediately handed them a piece of meat of the exact same value, you were essentially saying, "We are now even. Our relationship is over. I don't want to owe you, and I don't want you to owe me." Debt was connection. Debt was survival. You wanted to be in debt to your neighbors, and you wanted them to be in debt to you. It meant you were part of a web of mutual care. But then, we made a trade. We invented agriculture 9. We stopped moving. We built cities. Suddenly, you weren't living with 150 people you had known since birth. You were living in ancient Mesopotamia alongside thousands of strangers. You couldn't just rely on a mental web of favors anymore. The social glue began to break down. This is when the nightmare of modern debt was truly born. The temples and palaces of Mesopotamia needed a way to keep track of who had contributed to the grain silos and who had taken from them. So, they invented writing. The very first written documents in human history weren't poetry or philosophy. They were spreadsheets. They were clay tablets recording debts. For the first time in human evolution, debt was stripped of its humanity. It was no longer a social relationship between two neighbors. It was a cold, hard number carved into clay. And with the numbers came something far more dangerous: interest. Ancient farmers would borrow grain in the winter to feed their families, promising to pay it back after the harvest, plus a little extra. But nature is unpredictable. A drought would hit, a flood would wipe out the crops. The farmer couldn't pay back the grain, but the math on the clay tablet didn't care about the weather. The math didn't care about the flood. The interest kept compounding. Very quickly, ancient societies ran into a mathematical wall. The debt would grow exponentially, but the stock of wheat can only grow so fast, but interest on a clay tablet grows as fast as the creditor wants it to. Farmers would lose their land to the wealthy creditors. Then, to pay off the remaining debt, they would have to sell their sheep, then their plows. And finally, when they had absolutely nothing left, they had to sell their children into debt slavery. And then they would sell themselves. You might be wondering, where do coins fit into all of this? If they didn't invent money to barter, why did physical money ever exist? The answer is war. As empires grew, they needed standing armies. If you are an ancient king and you have 50,000 soldiers camped outside your city, you have a massive problem. Soldiers don't farm. They don't produce anything. They just consume. And if you don't feed them, they will turn around and overthrow you. So, how do you feed 50,000 men without bankrupting the palace? You invent physical coins. You stamp your face on little pieces of silver or gold. Then, you hand those coins to your soldiers. But a piece of silver is useless to a soldier. They can't eat it. So, the king does something brilliant and terrifying. He decrees that every single citizen in the empire must pay a tax at the end of the year, and that tax can only be paid using the king's coins. Suddenly, the farmers have a problem. If they don't get the king's coins, they will be thrown in prison or killed. Where do they get the coins? They have to trade their grain, their chickens, and their shoes to the soldiers in exchange for the silver. The king doesn't have to forcefully collect grain from the farmers to feed his army anymore. By creating a tax and creating coins to pay it, he has forced the entire society into a market economy. Physical money was not invented to make trade easier for ordinary people. It was invented by states to fund wars and force the population to feed the military. It turned human beings who used to rely on mutual generosity into individuals desperately scrambling for metal discs just to avoid being crushed by the state. Between the compounding interest on the clay tablets and the brutal taxation of the empires, society was tearing itself apart. Within a few generations of inventing mathematical debt, entire populations of ancient empires were being reduced to slaves, working on the land they used to own, just to pay off the interest of a few bad harvests. The wealthy were hoarding all the land, and the poor were suffocating under numbers they could literally never repay. But ancient humans did something that modern humans have completely forgotten how to do. They recognized that the system was broken. They recognized that math should never overrule human survival. The kings of ancient Mesopotamia, like Hammurabi, realized that if everyone was a debt slave, there would be no one left to fight in the army. If the inequality got too extreme, the empire would collapse from the inside. So they created a biological and economic failsafe. When a new king took the throne, or when a society reached a breaking point, the king would issue a decree. In the ancient Sumerian language, the word was amarchi, which translates roughly to a return to the mother. We know it today as the debt jubilee. The king would literally order the clay tablets to be smashed. Every single consumer debt in the kingdom was instantly wiped to zero. If you had lost your land to a creditor, it was given back to you. If your children had been sold into debt peonage, they were freed and returned to your house. The slate was wiped completely clean. This wasn't a one-time fluke. For thousands of years, across multiple ancient empires, wiping out all debt was a standard, necessary function of society. We even have proof of this on one of the most famous historical artifacts in the world. The Rosetta Stone, which sits in the British Museum today, isn't just a translation guide for ancient languages. The actual text carved into the stone is an announcement by a pharaoh canceling debts and granting an amnesty to the people. The ancients understood something fundamental that we have blinded ourselves to. When the math of debt destroys the fabric of society, it is the mass that has to be thrown out, not the people. But eventually, the empires got too big. The creditors got too powerful. The kings stopped issuing jubilees. To keep the system running, the creditors had to do something insidious. They had to convince the people that debt wasn't just a mathematical ledger. They had to convince them it was a moral obligation. This is where the psychology of debt completely warped. In many ancient languages, the word for debt and the word for sin are the exact same word. If you look at early translations of religious texts like the Lord's Prayer, they originally read, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors." Over time, as debt became more deeply institutionalized, that translation was softened to sins. They took an economic tool and turned it into a weapon of guilt. If you couldn't pay your debts, you weren't just a victim of a bad harvest anymore. You were a bad person. You were a sinner. You deserved your poverty. That moral shift is the ghost that still haunts us today. It's the reason people feel profound shame when they have to declare bankruptcy, even though corporations do it as a routine business strategy. Today, we don't smash the tablets. If a modern financial institution makes terrible bets and faces bankruptcy, governments will rush in to bail them out, effectively hitting the reset button for the people at the top. But if you fall behind on your medical bills, your student loans, or your mortgage, there is no jubilee. There is no emargy. You inherited a nervous system built for a world where debt meant mutual care, generosity, and community. When you get an email from a debt collector, or when you see your bank balance drop below zero, your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow, the cortisol levels flood your bloodstream. Your brain reacts to financial debt the exact same way your ancient ancestors' brains reacted to being stalked by a predator in the dark. But you can't run from it. You can't fight it with a spear. It is an invisible predator that lives inside your phone and your mailbox, and it stalks you every hour of every day. We took the most ancient human mechanism for survival, the idea that we owe each other, and turned it into a weapon. We stripped it of forgiveness. We made it inescapable. We live our lives constantly comparing ourselves to strangers, working jobs we don't believe in to pay off compounding numbers that our ancestors would have literally wiped away with a swing of a hammer. Your ancestors wouldn't look at our financial system and think we were advanced. They would look at our towering skyscrapers and our credit scores and think we had reached the peak of evolution. They would look at the stress in our faces, the years we spend working just to pay off the interest on our own survival, and a profound isolation of living in a society where nobody owes anyone anything anymore. They would recognize it exactly for what it is. They would say we are a society of slaves, waiting for a king to snatch the tablets.